Good to see you all, or at least see some familiar names and faces here. I'm happy to have you all here for the August steering committee meeting. So we know that there's a lot going on in Milwaukee this week, especially after the weather events of last week and everything. And hope everyone's safe and really appreciate you all making the time to be here with us tonight and making this a priority. So we'll go ahead and get started. We have a lot to get through, a lot of content. And it's going to be, I think, mentioned in just some of the preceding emails that there would be a lot to get through, and we'll be sharing a lot of information. So we do have some digital methods of providing feedback tonight. It is the older sort of poll everywhere tool that we've used previously, and not the Mentimeter, which you may not remember the two differences, but most notably, we will not have to wait to change slides until people have finished giving their feedback. That will sort of remain on in the background. So once we get to the first slide that has that, we'll let people get it set up. But if you have a phone or want to use a different web browser, whatever's easiest, you'll be able to do so. I also just want to invite people generally to come off mute and use the chat feature to share questions, whatever feels easiest to you. While there is a lot of content, a lot we want to get through, we also want to make sure that we're, touching on things clearly and answering questions that folks have along the way. So certainly, please feel free to do that. And the last bit I'll note is that we are going to send out an email right after this meeting with the presentation, the full PDF of the presentation, so that you can look through it. You'll notice as we go through the slides, and I'll speak to it as we go through it as well, but there is probably a little more content than necessary, just because we know when you're looking at it later on, we wanted to make sure that you had sort of the full context throughout. So I may start to move fast through some of the slides that feel a little more repetitive, but again, if a question comes up, please don't hesitate to throw something in the chat or come off mute. So for the agenda tonight, we'll touch on some quick administrative updates, then just do a quick run through of the process to date that led us to where we are, along with some updates, a lot of which were informed by the feedback that we heard from you all during the July meetings. And then we'll go into just sort of an overview of how we started to develop the scenarios that we're going to review this evening. Before moving into the section where we're going to talk about the input that we got from you all related to the strategy weighting and prioritization piece. And then we'll move into those scenarios. So there will be sort of a scenario A and a scenario B. And there is more in sort of that fifth section that we'll touch on in the third section and then get to it. So, there is like questions that may come up that may also be answered a little later on. And then finally, if there's time, we can speak a little bit about engagement planning and what to look ahead to in September. So just at the top for the first administrative update, we did want to share the tentative town hall meeting dates that we're holding for next September. So again, this will be sent out, and I think we're still waiting for final confirmation, but we are relatively confident that these will be the dates and times. We wanted to make sure that we shared them with you all as soon as possible, just because, this will be held in place of the September steering committee meeting. So there will not be regional or virtual or any sort of steering committee meetings in September. There will be these in-person town hall events. We ask that you all try to join us for at least one in-person town hall, and more to come on that later. But the reason we want to share early on is because we want you all to be active participants sort of in that in those meetings. We're still sort of working out the details of what that might look like from a formatting standpoint. And obviously we won't put someone on stage who's uncomfortable with being on stage sort of thing. It's not like that, but we want to be really transparent and explicit that our intent is not for you to be another audience member, but someone who can share their perspective and about their experience going through the process, given all the time that you all have put in for this process. So as I said, we'll follow up as soon as we have those dates and locations confirmed, but wanted to put them on your radar as soon as possible. And then the last thing I'll note on this is we are pulling together, just based on the suggestion from last month's meeting, some sort of templated marketing materials that can help sort of spread the word, PowerPoint slides, email blast information, social media posts, things of that nature. digital flyer so that it's easy to share the word. And this is a flyer from the last town hall that we did. Any questions on this before I move on? Just because I know this is, we won't touch on this again until the very end. So, all right. From there, we wanted to give a quick update on the policy initiative review. So as of Tuesday, we had 29 responses. I think a few more have trickled in since then. But we are going to keep the form open until early Monday morning, just given, some of the challenges that people have been dealing with in the last week. We wanted to make sure that folks had a chance to complete it. I did send out a reminder to those who we haven't heard from yet earlier today, just to let them know that there would be more time. So hopefully folks have a chance to complete that. And then just before we, continue on, wanted to share sort of a sentiment before getting to the feedback piece, but wanting to emphasize about the policy initiative review as well as the scenarios, like really that this is not set in stone. We are thinking very much like comma and not period. These are still evolving, and we absolutely want to hear your feedback on of these sort of policies, or if there's something that you feel was like explicitly missing or you're not sure where it came from. A couple questions have come up about like, hey, I don't remember necessarily talking about this specific idea in our steering committee meeting, and just highlighting the crux of having 5 steering committees. There are sort of different regional perspectives and focuses that are happening there, and knowing that taking time to read all 5 sets of meeting notes every month is probably a tall order. So that being said, we want to make sure that we're giving you sort of a full illustration and context around it. So please don't hesitate to ask if you have questions about it. And I also wanted to point out, like, we've had people reach out to note that, there have been similar initiatives or similarly named initiatives that might create confusion with MPS, where MPS had tried to do something called something similar previously. And so we can, workshop that and catch these things in advance. So just to use that as an example, we really, really do value your feedback and input to make sure that, we aren't something isn't getting caught off guard or sort of put to the side for the wrong reasons because we missed a smaller detail or didn't have the sort of full historical context up front. So we certainly would love to hear from you all on that. So with that, we did just want to create a little space at the top and spend a few minutes to hear if anybody has particular feedback on the policy initiatives. We know that those went out a little bit later than we had intended, just getting them sort of up to snuff, and that there isn't, full information in them, but wanting to make sure that people have a chance to sort of share their input or any questions they might have. So
Hello,
feel free.
Nate.
Yeah,
This
go ahead.
is Sharita. I'm sorry, my video isn't on.
All good.
The one about the busing in the 90s, there would be, I don't know when the shift happened, but there used to always be that connect. So
Yep.
so that I know that's not a new initiative that's
Right.
revisited.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I think sort of along the same lines, right? Like some of these are more focused on enforcing existing policies that maybe aren't being enforced, or yes, trying something that has been tried or is in effect in some form or fashion, right? Like we spoke about during the transportation meeting that Reagan has public busing available to those students and that there are stops near that school, and that it is more of a, more of a standard process for that school community. So I think what we, and this was additional feedback that we got as well, is just if there are instances where something has been tried to some extent in the past, you could even think of like the staffing standards of care and how that is different from like the AMP standards where schools are required to provide art, music, and PE to some degree. Like not just calling out what a policy initiative is, but also how it differs from what is in place or what needs to be, what the suggestion is that is, contrasting and different from the last go around, so that we don't just say, great, are we just, starting back on things that we've already tried and maybe didn't work before. So yeah, it's a really good point. Thank you so much for sharing. Paula, did I see your hand up as well?
I guess, yes. Hi, Nate,
Hey.
and everyone. Um, I guess the question I had was that related to whether these policies were part of the broader policies that I've been reading about. It's in the newspaper that the superintendent and the board were going to review and update all of the existing policies. Would these policies be considered new?
I think I can address that one. I think what you may be reading about, Paula, is the board is adopting a new policy structure called Neola. It's one that's policy program that's designed specifically for educational entities. Pretty used fairly, I didn't realize how extensively it was already used throughout the state. So we are adjusting our policies to align with that. But these items here would probably be viewed as, in some cases, maybe new to that policy, or maybe we could work some of those into some of the policy review that we're going to have to do with, this new policy format. But again, the policy format is a little bit, out there still. We're working on it. It's a big task.
Yes. Thanks, Michelle.
All right, thanks.
Any other questions or feedback folks want to share before we move on? Maybe one more time for one more person.
Hi, Nate. We had already talked a little bit, but I feel, and you answered quite a few of my questions, so thank you for taking time to do that. I think the piece that I would love to see brought out of the 12 that, or added in or highlighted someplace, and I mentioned this to you already, is something to do with having responsive or having a system of responses when something isn't going well. So we can set goals for schools, and several of the pieces that I think are already in there are talking about having clear goals, but then having a system of response, like an RTI system for schools, having some way that central office is committing to being a responsive partner to the individual needs of schools.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, and I know that was something that you and I had discussed and that had been discussed in some of the steering committee meetings. So definitely taking that one back, and I appreciate you sharing with the wider group here too. So if anybody else has additional ideas that they feel like maybe were talked about and we haven't captured already, as I mentioned at the top, like 12 is not a magic number. It is not meant to be definitive or limiting. So if there are other initiatives that we think would really sort of supplement or add to it, we are here for it. So thanks for sharing, Rebecca. All right, I will move into just some really quick high level sort of takeaways from what we're hearing so far on these initiative results. So these are just those last two questions for those of you who have completed, or I guess 2 of the last 3 questions who have completed the evaluation form already, where you're sort of ranking in terms of importance, or excuse me, in terms of priority, both the long-term policy initiatives and the short to medium term. So for the long-term initiatives, here are sort of the rankings that we're seeing. We've sort of paraphrased them for simplicity. And then on the right, you're seeing just how many votes they got for sort of first place, second place, and third place, and so on. So the more orange/red you see at the top means they got higher sort of rankings across the board. And these are from those 29 submissions. So you'll see staffing standards of care at the top of the list. And then the transit shift to public buses sort of as the lowest priority there for long term. On the short to medium term policy initiatives, we're seeing a little more contrast here for these top 3. You can see that these 3 were more consistently ranked as high priority than the bottom 3, and that is, sort of enforcing those enrollment and class size standards, availability of school and program information online, and then having a centralized facilities funding model. That's sort of a more equitable equitable approach as it was outlined there. So this is sort of what we're seeing at this point. More to come on this as we sort of wrap this up Monday morning, but wanted to make sure that we gave you all sort of an update on where things stand. All right. So next we'll move into sort of the process review and updates piece. Just wanting to really ground people in this again. I know that you've all seen this before, so I will move quickly. This is the initial project timeline we had laid out, and then sort of folding in the steering committee process to that options development piece before going out for broader engagement on these proposed options, which we are going to share with you all tonight, sort of in their draft format. The guiding principles that we laid out, I won't read through each of them, but just wanted to have them here for context, what those primary data inputs were that created the preliminary sorting tree, what the 7 strategy candidate groups were that were at the end of the sorting tree. Here is that sorting tree that you see here. And then moving into that was sort of leaving off where we were last month with the weighting scenarios and using those sort of secondary data inputs. So from a process update standpoint, a few things we want to call out. This is a great slide because it's got a ton of words on it. That's a joke. But please don't try to read all of it now unless you really want to. I will do my best to summarize it. We just wanted to give you the comprehensive sort of breakdown, but we have updated the composite building score. So that is the score that factored in air conditioning, facility condition index, and EUI, which is energy use intensity, or how much energy a building consumes every year. And the way that we had been doing it previously was decile rankings. So, sort of breaking all MPS schools into sort of groups of 10, with the top 10% receiving a perfect score of 10, and so on, working down the list. What we've done now is shifted to sort of a tiered quadrant model, which are more sort of grounded in what the target sort of scores should be for those different categories. So FCI having some pretty, standard groupings for great, good, fair, and poor. EUI in the similar vein, the EPA puts out targets for K-12 facilities, and that's what these are based on. So your best score is a 15 to 25, and the lowest score is at 55 plus, sort of meeting there. And so what this does is it allows for schools that may have had sort of ballooned, building scores. What we found is, just given that there are many buildings within the district that don't have any air conditioning, and there are a handful that have some air conditioning, but not a lot. So a little bit, we found that those schools that had sort of the some air conditioning were getting an overweighted score, lifting them up to a higher level because they were, they had a non-zero sum, which sort of gave them a balloon score. So what this does is make sure that, we're not saying that having 16% of air-conditioned spaces is the target area, right? Like in a target sense, we'd like to have at least 75 to 100% spaces that are air-conditioned in sort of that top tier category. So hopefully this makes sense, but it did overall just sort of bring those scores back down because there were some that had sort of been ballooned up. So we'll speak to that in a little bit, but that data has been sort of updated throughout. The next update that we want to speak to is just folding in that updated composite building score data, as well as school year 2024-25 data to create those school groupings, strategy candidate groupings, excuse me. There are some data points that aren't populated yet. So one of those being program offerings, which we're still working to update from last year. As we talked about in that sort of program focused meeting where we had Dr. Hill come and speak, an example would be the gifted and talented programs that are being sort of integrated into standard school models as opposed to being a standalone specialty program. So we want to make sure that that data is reflected correctly and that it's not sort of double counting or being counted incorrectly in any way. So what you'll see as we go through the presentation is that the program data is not yet populated here. We are working to get that all updated so that we can, sort of reflect those details appropriately. Melinda, did you have a question?
Yes, I'm just wondering if any of the updates when looking at the fact of the AC component, was there any update based on the fact that the district lost their Head Start program and how that affected the enrollment status at certain schools?
We did not factor in lost. I mean, I guess, are you saying like because that the Head Start program no longer exists, enrollment declined as a result. Was that captured anywhere
Yes.
as a factor?
Yes, because enrollment did affect, I mean, the loss of Head Start did affect enrollment in certain communities, because when the district added 3 and 4-year-old programs back in, a lot of those sites were placed, there were 18 sites, and at least I want to say it was like 10 or 11 of them were South Side locations. And so what happened is, if a parent wanted their child to be in a school that had the earlier, you didn't only lose those little kids, but you lost their siblings as well.
Siblings, yeah.
And so one of the things I had been looking at is the distribution of those early childhood placements and where they were placed in the district. And it was done really quick without a lot of discussion at the time as well.
Yeah, thank you for flagging that. I don't, and Michelle, I saw you came off mute. I don't know if you want to speak to it, but I certainly think that's something that could be easily sort of supplemented to look at. I mean, we've certainly been looking at enrollment, but sort of laying that over, I think, should be hopefully relatively straightforward. But Michelle, did you want to?
Sorry. No, actually, I just finished my dinner, so I was just turning my camera and stuff back on.
Okay, no problem. But yeah, no, Melinda, thank you so much for flagging that. I think we'll absolutely make sure that we added to take a look. And I think as we get through stuff tonight, you'll kind of see how things are showing up, and just in terms of checking where enrollment drops happen and how much of that may have had a correlation with Head Start changes. It's a really good point. Other than that, we did want to note that the data used to analyze schools and closure merger strategy candidate group, which will be, a large portion of what we go over here tonight, is updated data. So there aren't pending updates that would sort of change that. So as we updated that strategy candidate data, the strategy candidate group shifted as well. So as I mentioned, a lot of those composite building scores went down. So you may have seen some schools that shifted strategy candidate groups. A perfect example is schools that may have been in the sole programmatic investment candidate group, but now because their building score went lower and below the threshold, it would now be sorted into both the building and programmatic investment group, because it sort of filters into both of those. And then we did want to highlight, some updates that happened with from a data front. Otherwise, so just some changes from the district, even with Grant Gordon sort of winding down as a program, we've removed that from the list. Fratney changing from an elementary to a K-8. Keefe and Marshall, this was just a wire crossing on data. If you look back at our earlier sort of materials that we've shared and the tools with like the mapping and the clustering model and everything else, previous presentations, Keefe had been on that list, Marshall had been sort of reassigned from that list. So this was only on the strategy web tool where that had somehow been crossed, and we have sort of corrected that and made sure that everything is showing correctly there. Next, we had Carver Elementary, which is removed from the closure merger list. Carver actually went from being under 50% utilization to being over 50% in the past year. So as such, was removed from the list. And then just sort of a downstream impact of that from a proximity perspective, Holmes also came off the list because it was no longer within proximity of a closure of a underutilized school, and Sherman was also a proximity reassignment. So those schools are no longer on the closure merger list. So that list has gone from 13 schools to 10 schools total, which you will see here in a second, but we wanted to make sure to call those out. One more update on the sort of strategy candidate group piece. So this was really grounded heavily in the feedback that we heard from you all in July, and just maybe some perceived shortcomings of the strategy web tool as well, right? Like not being able to compare larger groups of schools against one another, using those sort of data weights and prioritization weights to see how the schools fall. So what we've done is actually combine these, sort of consolidate the 7 strategy candidate groups back into 3 smaller groups, or I guess into 3 high-level categories, if you will. So one of them being program-focused investment, which takes all the schools in the building and programmatic and the programmatic investment groups, and then the building and focused investment, which takes from 5 different groups, which all had some sort of building focused investment component to it. So a way that it might be helpful to think about this, and what we wanted to make sure, as we were thinking about implementation, that we wanted to avoid was, should the district be looking to invest in a building, for example, and is looking at the list of building investment candidates, we wouldn't want for a high priority school to be overlooked because it was on the building and programmatic list. So what we've done is combined all those schools onto both lists, if they fall in both categories, that is, so that if the district is pursuing a building focused investment, it's looking at any school that would have sort of those similar characteristics and would sort of rise to a higher tier on those lists. And same with programmatic focus investments. So it is not to say that we are washing out the 7 previous categories. For example, a school that's high on the building focused investment list, I believe, is 81st Street, which is also on the building addition list. So what that is like, what we're trying to say there is, just because 81st Street may be reading as a candidate for, expanding the building due to overutilization, that doesn't necessarily mean the building is in good shape. So adding new space onto it doesn't necessarily address issues if the space is not adequate as is the existing space. So we think this is, as much as I've said a whole lot to try to explain it, we think this is simpler and more straightforward. The closure merger group we have kept there just because we feel that those metrics that are leading the groups into there, with low enrollment and utilization and proximity to other underutilized and under-enrolled schools, as well as some of the building conditions that are in those groups, still sort of are appropriate. So I think that was it for the process updates. Any questions on these? I know there's a sort of a lot to sort of digest there. All right. Happy to jump back too if it's helpful to connect dots later. Otherwise, we'll move into the scenario development piece. So as I mentioned, there are 2 scenarios that we're going to be looking at tonight. But before we get into those, just wanting to highlight some of the important pieces from a high level that we wanted to ground ourselves in. So when you're hopefully this is not new. I know we've talked about that it should be a multi-step process, and that is a recommendation that we really want to make sure we're ringing the bell on in the sort of final product. But having sort of that planning and preparation year, that midsection, whether it be 1 year or more, for launch and rollout. So if that's a programmatic investment, a building investment, which might, depending on the scope, if you're constructing new, for example, like design and construction can take more and will take more than a year typically, whereas a programmatic investment might not take as long. And then being sure to have sort of that final step of monitoring and evaluation. How is that working? What can we do better next time? How can we adjust the process? So really wanting to highlight that. And then from a sequencing of strategies, a lot of the feedback we heard from you all sort of last month and throughout is just that, building focused investments are really high priority, and that the district should be focused on addressing some of the building challenges it has, and that there are a lot of great programs that exist, and it might be more of a challenge of sort of marketing them in a lot of spaces. So that's not to say program focused investments aren't important. We have just sequenced it so that building would come first. And then we have kept closure merger at the front of the list, just knowing that it is a priority for the district to make sure that it's sort of addressing some of those longstanding challenges from that perspective. So we have policy considerations sort of folded in there, and then just in a planning point, we want to really make sure that we're highlighting that in terms of allocating the appropriate resources to support any of those strategies. All right. So with closure merger, we also wanted to reground ourselves in the why and what this actually does for the student experience and how it benefits students. It can be really easy to lose sight of that. So we wanted to just, revisit some of those points that we've discussed and brought up in the past, and how this can help students by having sort of fewer and fuller schools, but staff on site, increasing FTE, access to programs, schools being able to offer more with sort of larger enrollments, and as such, sort of larger budgets that would come along with it. Teacher collaboration, so having multiple teachers at the same grade level and allowing them to work together. So, an elementary school that has 2 second grade teachers, and those teachers being able to plan and coordinate, as opposed to having 1 teacher per grade level. And then again, just enhancing learning environments, having those resources to sort of make those improvements, and also do that in a sustainable long-term way by having fewer and fuller schools. So this is one that we got some really good feedback on last night, actually, which I'll touch on. But what we're trying to show here is the impact of school size and how, from a cost perspective, smaller schools, smaller enrollment schools, which does not necessarily equate to smaller class sizes, but schools with lower enrollment have a higher cost per student and cost more generally to operate because of those fixed costs that are unavoidable when you're, operating a school building. So as we've dug in with, some folks on our team who are working on sort of the financial analysis piece of this, this top table that you're seeing here in blue is the recorded school budgets for FY26 for this next school year. And so this is, and I do want to call out, this excludes special education funding altogether. So it does not factor that in. But you'll see that schools under at 200 students or lower are spending, around $3,500 more on average per student than schools that are at 300 or above. So really a stark contrast there. And that is not to say those dollars are necessarily going towards those students and that, this money is sort of like it's better for students to have more money there. This is factoring in that feedback we got last night. We really want to tell this story appropriately, that it's about like the school's sort of purchase power, if you will, and being able to use its resources and spread them more effectively to have a greater amount of staff because they are spending less on those fixed costs in general. And then on the bottom table, what you're seeing there is we've folded in not just the school budget costs, but also the services that are provided at a district-wide level. So I could think about like nurses or things like that, but also transportation, utilities, things of that nature. And so these are estimated costs, but you're seeing that sort of delta between those two numbers grows pretty significant, above 50% more per student for those smaller enrolled schools. So this does also sort of tie back to some of those policy initiatives that are around, target school sizes and what enrollment should look like to have sort of this healthy and sustainable school from a financial perspective. So again, we think it's important to highlight this connecting back to that last slide of what are those dollars go to and how do they help students? But we do think it's also an important point to make. So here is a high-level overview of the two scenarios that we have developed. I do want to point out at the top, if you have questions, I would ask maybe just hold them. There's a few more slides and then we can take a break, but there's a little more context in the coming slides on what these two scenarios are. So scenario A is where we've identified closure and receiving schools. This is more of a merger-focused approach where you have one or more schools sort of merging into that receiving school. These are all schools that would be sort of on that closure merger list. And then you would highlight those receiving schools as top priority for investments, whether that be building or programmatic, to really try to help mitigate the disproportionate impact there. Scenario B is where closure schools are identified, but receiving schools are not. So the difference would be that students would get priority enrollment access to the schools of their choice. So there would be help in theory from the sort of district office level, folks at MPS who would be supporting these families and finding schools that are, what they determine to be the best fit. A few points on this that have come up at the last couple meetings. One is that we have not spoken in depth with the enrollment team about this, and obviously there would need to be some coordination. It ties to the policy piece around enforcing enrollment caps as well, right? Like there are some steps that need to be taken. However, it's our understanding that there is some degree of precedent for, having priority access for enrollment. So this would all be contingent on working that out with the enrollment team if that was sort of the path that was selected for a recommendation. This would also allow for investments to be prioritized based on greatest need, sort of those tiered lists that we're going to show a little bit later, and that'll make more sense when I get to it. And then the last piece that I wanted to mention that came up for that priority enrollment access, in our working draft sort of thinking on it, the thinking would be that those students would also have access to schools that were, technically overutilized and over-enrolled as sort of a one-time exception to it. But that is obviously, not determined and not definitive at this point. But it wouldn't be to say you can pick from schools that are on this shorter list, but really trying to, allow them to make those decisions. So just to summarize that a little differently, like scenario A is very community focused. So trying to keep schools and school communities together. really making it much simpler for the district to follow those students with resources and have the investments sort of have the greatest impact on those students and families who are impacted. Scenario B is far more focused on individual support, allowing students to choose their schools and to invest in the schools with sort of this more neutral, I guess, sense of greatest need from an investment perspective. And you could also factor in, geographic distribution, or if the district decides it wants to focus specifically on high schools, like there are many filters that could be applied to that, but that's sort of a high level overview. And then scenario A, this is just a quick illustration showing, these schools merging into a single school, whereas scenario B would be schools closing and students dispersing elsewhere. A couple other points that have been brought up that I think are worth mentioning, and just as I mentioned those, this is our feedback break. If you want to scan the QR code, or Nazar will drop the link in the chat. So you can just click on it if you're using the same machine. These are just open-ended prompts. If you have feedback you want to share and you don't feel like coming off mute, please feel free to do so. If you have a question, it might be easier to come off mute or even throw that in the Zoom chat. Sorry to sort of have a triple way to do it. But yeah, go ahead, Melinda.
Okay, so my question was on slide 25. Does this take into account the latest report that was presented at the school board meeting, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, about the class sizes being over-enrolled in the district?
It does not take into account a report that is within 2 weeks notice. No, we had been sort of developing these separately from that. Do you want to elaborate on what you think the impact on that might be?
Well, I'm just wondering, with closures and mergers, of course, the, schools that are under 200, they're, majority of the funds that are going to that building is paying for your engineer, your secretary, your principal, and your food service manager.
Right.
Because I know there's some schools out there that literally have about 7 staff members that could be filling in the gaps in other schools. But when you're looking at the number of students in a classroom, because they don't have the staffing for it, I think that would have an impact on a lot of this. And I think that has to be looked at, and looking at when talking to the team. You mentioned the team, the enrollment team. Taking a look at, are they looking at the needs of those schools and the number of students in classrooms? Because some schools, they don't close the enrollment. So, the number was 32, but then you end up with 35, 40 kids in a classroom, and how a lot of that affects the school culture is huge. And so, so we want to make sure also that we're looking at the fact of what the enrollment types are and what the capacity of those buildings are, and whether or not any policies will change at in student enrollment, where they're not just consistently, even though they see that this number is filled, but because the school is there, we're going to go ahead and we're going to put them in this spot, even though we're saying we're over enrolled. We have too many kids in the classroom. Our buildings, our class is too small. This room is too small based on the fact that you're saying this is the number of kids. However, you're not coming into the building and looking and see what the actual size of that classroom is, but you're sending me 40 kids.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that sounds very aligned with the sort of policy initiative that we had laid out for enforcing sort of enrollment sort of standards and limits that exist, class size, target sizes that exist. And that is something, so that part we have thought about as we've developed these. I just didn't want to speak definitively on a report that I'm not familiar with, but it was certainly a consideration, especially when considering, that 50% threshold. If there are schools that are close to it, like that, that should be taken into consideration, right? It's not a binary game of just like, yes, you're on this side, no, you're on that side, and sort of thing. So I think it'll all, as we get through it too, you'll start to see sort of how that is reflected, and we're going to dig into each scenario and the schools that are recommended with each. So hopefully it paints a more complete picture as we go through there. Casey?
Sorry. Yeah, I was just thinking about something I heard from a staff member that also talked about policies around like how many engineers a school gets based on square footage. And so I guess I was just thinking about, making sure we're looking at all the policies, because what I would hate to well, and I'll tell you the reason. So this school was over enrolled, but because of square footage, only had one engineer. And so their bathrooms were always running out of toilet paper and all these things because they had all these people in the school building, but because of the policy, of course, couldn't get another engineer. And so I think we just making sure we're looking at all the policies, because even with school closures, what I would hate to happen is that they're like, okay, well, because of our policies, now we can have less people, instead of saying we're merging schools, we're closing schools, and now the schools that are still open can have an abundance of people. So I guess we should just, I feel like, make sure.
Yeah, no,
we
it's
look at
a
all.
really salient point looking at the, I think that is something too where it feels directly connected to if there is an effort that is sort of taken up to try to enforce and hold schools, you know, more within those realms of sort of the utilization rates and what those capacities are. So limiting them so that they stop becoming so over enrolled to where an engineer can't keep up with their building. But it's not to say you can't look at both in a parallel lane. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Rebecca, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, thanks, Nate. When I was working with the data tool, the big question that came to my mind, and I think totally relates to your central question, which is how are we going to encourage kids to go to the new schools? And how are we going to invest our programming money? Is it going to be based off of local schools that we're saying these kids from this closing school are now merging into this other school? Or does the money follow the kids? And by following the kids, I guess that's my question is, has there been any data around the 10 schools that are on your closure list and whether those kids live in those communities? Because I remember one of our big points was that kids are being bused all over the place. And so it feels like if their school closes, why would they necessarily go to a school in that same community? If they're being bused 45 minutes already, why wouldn't they go to a school in their own community or that's closer to home? So I guess I was just wondering if there's been any look at where the kids are coming from that are in these 10 schools.
Short answer, yes, you are a handful of slides ahead of us, and that's where let me jump forward and we'll get through the data. And I think a lot will be sort of, this is what I mentioned at the top too. Like I think as we move through the presentation, a lot of those sort of points will be illustrated, and then definitely want to hear, what are the things that you haven't seen that would still be helpful to sort of shine a light on things. So I'll move forward and we'll keep that poll everywhere sort of open and operating in the background until we get to sort of the next feedback break. I do want to make sure we have time to get to everything. So this is what you're looking at here is the committee input on an average scale. So let me just first say, thank you to you all and everyone who took the time to sort of complete this and provide so much thoughtful feedback along with sort of the weightings. We really do appreciate it, and it was really insightful. So just to explain what we're looking at here and sort of refresh people's memory. So 58% is that slider from 0 to 100. The average sort of amongst all committee members who submitted was 58%. It is not to say 58% of people did XYZ. So utilization rate was on average, the highest rated metric using that tool. And then going down the list from there, building condition, economic status and attendance area from a student perspective, academic performance, AC, ADA, accessibility, and then lead risk. So based on the feedback we heard from you all, as well as going back to when we had previously sort of done some engagement around these priority weightings, we have landed on these 5. So they're going to show up on this slide. We're sort of have a similar structure as we go through, so this will start to look familiar. But what you can see here is that we've sort of maintained, in alignment with what we heard from you all, utilization rate and building condition being the highest weights. We weighted ADA accessibility, so it still says compliance, but accessibility meaning wheelchair accessible to all academic spaces, just because it is not baked into that composite building score, and we think it does have important value. And then students in attendance area, trying to minimize the local impact as well as economic status. Academic performance was easily the most polarizing weighted characteristic, not just on this one, but on every piece. So you'll see as we go through that academic performance is not included, just because some people put it at 0, some people put it at 100. There was really a lot of difference and variability as to how that sort of weight was tallied. And so for now, we decided to leave it off. Obviously, these are dynamic and living tools. Should the district choose to sort of or prioritize that down the road, it is easy for them to do so. Then what you're seeing on the right here is that prioritized list of closure merger schools. So none of these schools are new from the list, but these are now ranked with the scores determined by these weights. So if you remember, the tool would assign sort of a priority score to show you sort of the gap between the two when looking at these metrics. So on the next slide, what I'll get to is we'll dig into sort of the comparisons of each one and show a little more data, and I think it'll become a little clear. That'll be on the next section. What we also wanted to make sure that we touched on in just the spirit of full transparency are the schools that, either with last year's data or with this year's data had been sort of initially sorted from a data-driven perspective into the closure merger category. So you'll see Carver Academy at the top there. I think I said elementary earlier, but Carver was out of this closure merger group this year after its utilization went above 50%. You'll also see like the alternative education high schools and high schools in general, which were, not sort of prioritized initially, just sort of taking this gradual approach given the quantity of smaller grade level schools. So, this is more of that data informed perspective, wanting to make sure that we are taking a close look and really focusing on the schools who are sort of consistently appearing on these lists. So this is a similar slide that we shared last October with the school board and just schools that had been reassigned, and wanting to make sure that we're highlighting that again. So from there, we have the building focused investment category. You can see sort of the average weighting that we got from you all. And again, we'll share this all with you all so that you can sort of take it back and take a closer look at it. But building condition, utilization, students in a tenure, economic status. So as you jump forward to see where we landed those weights, we also have building condition as the highest score, given that this is a building focused investment, really wanting to look at the quality of that building. Based on that, we also thought it was important to lift up, the age of the building, the ADA accessibility considerations for those buildings, as well as whether schools have air conditioning, knowing that that is really a top priority for bringing schools into sort of the 21st century from a learning perspective. Proximity to non-MPS schools was pretty consistently low rated throughout the tool. So we did leave that off for the time being altogether. And then we have economic status, utilization rate, and attendance area also there. So this list that you're seeing here, these are the tier 1 schools. You'll see that we have listed 3 tiers in this. These are just 10, sort of the 10 top scoring from a priority score standpoint schools. But knowing that, there is additional sort of evaluation that can and should be done on these schools to make sure that they, should be sort of a top tier. An example that came up in a previous meeting is like Milwaukee High School of the Arts had a building addition somewhat recently. So, recent investments is also something that I think should be taken into consideration. So that, again, there are other steps to be taken, but we wanted to highlight that. From an approach, what we do with this is, so we'll take these tiered lists plus those additional factors, receiving schools being one of them, if we end up going with a scenario A, as well as geographic distribution to make sure that you're having sort of a balanced impact from an investment standpoint, and move through those schools. From there, the program focused investments. So these are the scores that we saw from you all as it relates to program investments. Where we landed with those was program access being the highest, and regional access. So really making sure that there is, equity of access throughout the district in terms of how students can access the different program types that are offered at schools throughout. Economic status, as well as utilization rate and attendance area. So the reason this list, again, is not populated, we want to make sure we get that program data fully updated. We don't want to share a list and then have a school get removed from that list because we updated the data, and are really trying to make sure that we're, sound in what is being presented. So a very similar approach here, you know, that sort of tiered list with the additional factors. This is not an exhaustive list of additional factors, just a few examples. And then we did want to highlight, you know, the importance of the district working with the school community to determine what an appropriate programmatic investment would look like at a school, knowing that it's not a one-size-fits-all model. So we have the feedback break here. Happy to take a couple questions before moving on. If anybody wanted to dig into that. Otherwise, the next section will be looking at scenario A and scenario B.
Hi, Nate. This is Sharita. I
Hey,
have a question.
please.
Are all the schools on the closure list? If I'm not mistaken, weren't they all on the northwest side of Milwaukee?
They're all in the central region.
They're in the central region.
Yeah,
Well,
school board district 4, I believe, if my memory serves me.
okay.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that a little bit more to show just like a geographic analysis that's in the upcoming slides, just to show sort of how that was taken into consideration too. All right, I will keep moving. So scenario A, where we'll start, again, this is the merger focused approach where you have both closure schools and receiving schools who would receive those students from the closure schools, and then the receiving schools being prioritized for investments beyond just sort of the consolidated resources of having higher enrollment and as such sort of a larger budget to operate with. So some of the benefits of this approach that we want to make sure we call out, as I mentioned earlier, like keeping communities, students and communities together. So post-transition, having those folks in the same place, predictable planning for the district, allowing it to, you know, better target those investments, resources following kids, and potentially expanding the resources that are available at those receiving schools. So a really important point that we've talked about in the last couple meetings, but is that, you know, scenario A would not only you know, is not just focused on closure, but it also would take some of the schools that are on that closure merger list currently, and by increasing their enrollment and utilization rate, moving them off the closure merger list and allowing them to operate at a much healthier level from a budget perspective, resource perspective, and downstream effects of that with FTE and programs, presumably. So that is something that we think is important to call out here. And then, you know, this is the overall list of the proposed mergers that we have. So you'll see them sort of highlighted on the prioritized list here. We have our Ave, Keefe Ave merging into Douglas. So that would be sort of going to a K-8 model, Hopkins Lloyd into Jackson, Seifert merging into Brown Street, and Clark Street merging into Starnes Discovery Learning Center. So you know, we know that our Ave and Keefe Ave are elementary schools and Douglas is middle school, so we'll speak to that. And we know also, and I'll speak to it a little bit later, that Starnes and Clark, there is an offset on the grade level there as well. So we'll definitely touch on that, and I'm going to dig into each one of these scenarios individually. But yeah, Melinda, go ahead.
So listening to the whole idea of the merger to move to 8 model, again, going back to discussions of the changes that's going on in the district,
Yep.
where we know that our superintendent, our current superintendent, Dr. Cassell is not a fan of K-8 model. Many of us who are in K-8 schools are not a fan of K-8 models. It does not work. And so again, are you all aware of that? And is that part of those discussions on what would happen with those students, you know, if there was a dissolving of the K-8 model, you know, is there a model that would allow for space in middle schools to be able to have a middle school model versus the K-8 model?
Short answer, yes, we are aware of that, and this is not meant to be sort of a rigid proposal. You'll see even when we get into that first one, one of the points that we highlight on the sort of option A or option 1 there is that K-8 is not necessarily the only option that should be considered here. There could even be a consideration if the district wanted to explore, maintaining a traditional school, middle school, or even, approaching it from like a K-6 perspective and a 7-12, looking at North Division, which is nearby. Like there's a lot of different ways to approach this. But really, I think the key focus of that option would be to say Douglas remains open and is serving those other students. So I guess it wouldn't be the traditional model, but yeah, more to come on that. Kiana?
Yes, I just have a question.
Please.
Let's so focus to Melinda's statement about K-8 schools. I'm one of those parents. I have two kids that are in elementary school. One is going to middle school, and I've actually I visited both a 6 through 8 middle school model and a K-8 school. And my question is, what about K-8 models don't work? Mainly because I had one of the staff members at my son's school. He was elementary only, K-5, and she stated that K-8 schools are recommended versus transitioning a child from going straight just to a middle school. So just my question for your input, like what have you seen that's not that doesn't work with that transition?
The greatest feedback, especially that I get from high school principals, is our students coming into a high school from a K-8 versus a traditional middle school are not prepared for high school. They don't, so I'm a strong believer in middle schools. I went from Lancaster to John Muir Middle School to John Marshall High School. And so, that model, I did shop classes. I had the electives. I had all those things. You don't have all of those things in a K-8 model. Particularly at my school, I have one 6th grade, I have one 7th grade, I have one 8th grade. So you don't even have the collaborative piece. You don't have kids being able to transfer between classrooms. There's a lot that a middle school model offers our students that they are not getting. If you look across different states, my family is in Mississippi, and in Tupelo they have a entire campus that's just for their 9th graders because they know that those transition ages are important. And even in our schools right now, we see the struggle that's happening with what's the school over on off of Wisconsin? I can't think of the name. Yeah, WCLL, with it being a K-12 model. Those are a lot of different spirits to deal with, at various ages and developmental ages. And so, if I had children, I don't. I tell parents when they come to my school, welcome to share custody, because their children become mine. I wouldn't have my child in a K-8 school, but we try to to offer those things for them, but it's really hard to give the students the life, the developmental needs that they need in a K-8 model when you have one grade level of everything. And it's also hard to staff them. And so if you I try to do where I could have one teacher teaching social studies, reading, and students move between classes. But when you get to certain grade levels, they have to have the license. So if you don't have a license for being able to teach more than one reading class, or you don't have a math license or a reading license, you can't teach more than one reading class. You can't teach more than one math class. So everybody has to teach all of their subjects. So you want 6, 7, and 8 to be a master of all. Getting algebra in a K-8 school, your baby not getting it might be a sum, but algebra's not happening there. They're getting the 8th grade curriculum in that particular classroom. So, as a parent, as growing up in MPS, coming from a family of 8 that came through MPS and nieces and nephews, there's so many things that you can get from a middle school model that our children are missing out on in a K-8 model. So I hope that helps you.
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Melinda. I would just add quickly to that, in terms of like broader research that's been done on K-8s versus middles, there has been a lot of sort of studies done, and the short version is it's kind of a wash. There's not really a determination. Like they both have some pros and some cons in terms of like things that they do better and things that they don't do as well. But the general sort of consensus is that there is really not a one right way. So I'm happy to share any of the resources that I've looked at, but I certainly defer to the lived experience in MPS for this like very local application.
Yeah, in K-8, well, I mean, they'll give you you get the relationship component because your kids are with those same people from
Right.
from kindergarten through 8th grade. But from teaching middle school, from being in a K-8 school and teaching 6th, 7th, and 8th, one of the things my students shared with me, and I'm still, I still stay in contact with a lot of them, was that they needed to grow. So they needed that moment away from me because I saw them as this kindergarten, this first grade, I saw them growing up. And so now at 6th, 7th, and 8th, and when you get to those tweens, that 12-year-old and up, they need to be able to become their own person and develop, figure out who they are. And if they're around those same people who saw them as a kindergarten, they're already seeing it from their parents, it becomes a challenge for them.
So I want to make sure we can still get to everything. So I'm going to jump back to this, but thank you again for sharing. So just in terms of the considerations for selections of these schools, so really looking at smaller enrollment schools, trying to limit the impact, the number of students and families that would be impacted by a closure, knowing that, a school that's at 150 versus 250, that's 100 additional students and families potentially who might be impacted, in addition to some of the cost considerations that we talked about earlier. Proximity to one another, so trying to limit the travel increases and ease any transition from that perspective, and then sort of those building quality pieces, so building condition scores, age of the buildings, any recent investments, and just considerations around that piece. So we'll move into sort of each option that is outlined there. So this is a sort of standard cover slide that you'll see for each option, but just a map showing the schools and where they are from a distance perspective. So Douglas and Keefe obviously on the same sort of plot of land there, our being about a mile away in a car and just under on foot. What we've done on the next slide is just try to highlight some of those key data points that sort of went into the scoring here. So you'll see enrollment capacity, utilization, as well as percentages of economically disadvantaged students and how many students are living in the attendance area. So that is the percentage of these 150 students who are living within that attendance area. Douglas is one of the schools that does not have an attendance area. STARMS as well. So you'll see those just sort of placeholders there, and then the composite building score and ADA accessibility. So from there, we just wanted to give a quick overview of like what those key considerations were and the potential impacts. So you'll notice that all three of these schools are low enrollment, being under 200 students. None of the schools have air conditioning, so that is not sort of a factor that was considered there. However, Douglas is ADA accessible, while the others are not, and is 50 or more, I think 60 newer than our and 50 than Keefe, just so sort of a newer building, has received some investments and is just generally in better shape than the other two. We do have placeholders here for the student travel distance. We just wanted to illustrate to you all, as we move into these September meetings, sort of how we want to approach the data and make sure that we're painting a complete picture for families, what that combined enrollment would be. So moving well above sort of those thresholds from an enrollment perspective, so close to 400 kids. Now Douglas is still a massive building, so the utilization rate is still relatively low, but we try not to hang our hat on a single data point there. And then the deferred maintenance cost is just the deferred maintenance that exists at Keefe and our combined. So we're trying to show just some of the details that are related to cost savings. So there would also likely be operational cost savings. It's a harder number to quantify with staff and who's moving where and sort of how that works, but that's something that we're also looking at. And then as I noted at the top, we're not sort of dead set on K-8 being the only answer. The district could explore other, alternative approaches if it so chose, but just as a starting point in terms of how this could be done. From there, we have Hopkins Lloyd merging into Jackson. So you'll see that these schools are quite close, just under half a mile, which is about a 10-minute walk and a 3-minute drive. They're serving the same grade levels. So Hopkins Lloyd having that lower enrollment than Jackson at 142. Jackson having, a significantly higher utilization rate already, and then the composite building scores sort of standing out. So building quality is something that will come through as we move to the next slide. As I noted, low enrollment at Hopkins Lloyd. Jackson is fully air conditioned. It is ADA accessible, and it is 84, years newer than the Hopkins Lloyd building. I do want to note here too, and something that came up, like we understand that Hopkins Lloyd was a merger that was done, and that there is a lot that can be learned from how that process sort of went, and looking back and making sure that, you know, those sort of lessons are being folded into this approach, and that the district isn't sort of moving forward with these without really looking at not just, you know, for Hopkins Lloyd, but for any of them, sort of how closures and mergers have gone previously. What I do want to point out is like the enrollment of that merged school moving almost to an 80% utilization threshold, which is really that sweet spot that you like to see in a school. Really sort of a healthy utilization well beyond the closure merger list at that point, and having that high enrollment and more cost efficient to operate. The deferred maintenance costs here from Hopkins Lloyd showing, and then operational costs as well. From there, we'll go to Seifert and Brown Street. So you'll see about a mile between them. And then you'll see that Brown Street does have a notably higher utilization rate. Both have pretty low amounts of students coming from their attendance area. And the composite building score is lower at Brown, and we'll talk about that in a second, but it is ADA accessible. So Brown Street, while it is, you know, has a lower composite building score, that is because currently Seifert has no deferred maintenance costs, which is giving it a boost in its score. So we want to make sure we're looking at multiple components of that. So looking closer, we know that Brown Street has some air-conditioned academic spaces, while Seifert has none. Brown Street is about 20 years older, but it has a pretty significant building addition that was done in 1989 and others before that. But the most recent one had a gym, a cafeteria, a library, a main office. So, you know, much newer spaces, and wanting to take that into consideration as well. Clark Street merging into Starms Discovery Learning Center, so about a mile and under that if traveling on foot. Now, looking at Clark and Starms DLC, so it's important to note that kindergarteners are not housed at Starms Discovery Learning Center. They are housed at Starms Early Childhood Center, which is nearby. And so there would be one level of kindergarten that would need to transition in this theoretical approach to Starms DCC before matriculating to Starms DLC. However, the rest of the students would be sort of that shared grade level. So you'll see the higher utilization rate, close to 50%, honestly, and then a higher building score as well. And when we look at the considerations, so Clark Street being another low enrollment school, so trying to limit that impact on students and families. Starms is fully air conditioned, it is ADA accessible, and it is almost 90 years newer than Clark Street's building. So that combined enrollment puts it at a utilization of almost 70%, which, you know, again, well beyond the closure merger list. There is a modest sort of savings on a deferred maintenance front, and then just really wanting to highlight again that, you know, there would be some coordination that would need to be done on the kindergarten front. So from there, just wanting to look at the geographic impact analysis. So what you're seeing on the left, well, both of these maps. So every dot that is on there is a school. On the right, the reason these dots are two different colors, one is elementary, one is K-8, and unfortunately I cannot remember which is which, and we did not highlight it in the legend, but they are all MPS schools and showing their coverage. So what you've got here is a 0.5 mile radius is that yellow circle, and a mile is the green circle. So when you see those densities of like the darker yellow, almost orange, that is where there's a lot of schools within a half-mile radius of those areas, so providing very good coverage. And when you look sort of in this central region area, you can see that the coverage, at least as it relates to the rest of the district, is still, you know, relatively strong, even after, if you were to proceed with scenario A. From there, just highlighting the utilization impact, so the amount of seats available in the school board district. So I know, again, going back and forth between region and school board district from a geographic standpoint, wanted to make sure we threw a map in here. So most of those, I believe all of these schools are in school board district 4. So you'll see that the current capacity here in green is showing where that is. And then if you were to proceed with these closure merger approaches, that current capacity would drop down a bit, but still more than meeting the enrollment demands for the students who are currently attending school within that school board district. Finally, moving into the investment pieces. So as we mentioned, there would be sort of this top prioritization of receiving schools. We're calling that sort of that tier 0. So you'll see those 4 receiving schools there. And then these are the 3 tiers of building investment or building focused investment schools. We've added a couple asterisks to highlight schools that are on the building addition list as well. We would do the same thing for schools that are sort of dual appearing on the program list and the building list as well, just knowing that, you know, it is not sort of operating in isolation. I do want to speak to, you know, the fact that it came up in previous meetings about like high schools and whether they should be key focal points. So really wonderful feedback that we got from a steering committee member, knowing that, you know, MPS is losing most of its students in terms of enrollment drop off after 9th grade when students might be leaving the district. So perhaps the district should take a greater focus on high school. You know, these are filters that can be applied using these tools and look at, you know, what are sort of the top tier high schools from these perspectives, and a lot of different ways to sort of modify this and fit it to the approach. So I say that only to say, like, if you have other things that jump out at you or that you want to point out, like, we are certainly here for it. And just ringing the bell again that none of this is carved in stone. We very much want to hear your thoughts. From there, just highlighting sort of the regional distribution of those investment schools. So in the top tier, in tier 0, all those schools are central region. In tier 1, as it currently stands, you have 50% of the schools, so 5 of the 10 are in central region. And then it's a 2-2-1 breakdown, and you can kind of see how that plays out from there from a regional perspective. So just to show how that is displayed. And then I'll quickly go through program focused investment, very similar approach. Obviously, we do not have those lists populated quite yet. And we would sort of take a similar walk towards them. So this is a new sort of poll EV if you want to share feedback, or if anybody has a question and wants to come off mute, would certainly invite you to do so. Oh, I should mention, I don't think I mentioned at the top, sorry, Paula, one thing. This is not your only chance to submit feedback. We will have a forum coming out in the next day or two that will allow you to respond and look at this in greater depth and flip through everything. We certainly want to hear from you, and I want to make that really explicit. We're also building out that 5th step of the strategy web tool so that you can sort of explore the scenarios at a deeper level and sort of interact with it from a data perspective. So there is more coming. I'm sorry that I failed to mention that at the top. This is not your sole opportunity to provide feedback, and we certainly, that said, Paula, please go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Nate. This is a lot to take in, and I'm sure I don't understand it yet. But on a really basic level, I just want to make sure that I understand that given the merged schools in these 2 scenarios, or in scenario A, I guess, that then only 6 schools would actually close.
In scenario A, it would be 5 schools that would close. So there'd be,
5.
yeah, so it'd be, well, I can scroll back and just show. So 4 schools would be receiving, and the one that was off the list, let me just jump back to this earlier slide here that has all of them, is La Follette. So La Follette, just from a proximity standpoint, didn't make sense as a receiving school. It's also on the low end of the closure merger list, so it didn't make sense as a priority for closure or merger as well. And I think this will, as we get to scenario B, I think that'll make a little more sense.
Okay. And the savings that you list, or potential saving, 2 million, and another that was 2.some million, and then 200,000. So in total, and again, I assume those are annual costs. So would we be talking about $6-7 million a year, just in terms of operational costs?
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing it up. So this is cost avoidance in the sense that these are deferred maintenance projects that are scheduled to, take place and, going
Oh,
forward on these buildings in order to keep them up. So it's not a savings that would sort of populate
I see.
in terms of money back, but it would be
Okay.
money not spent.
Okay.
But yeah, and
All
then
right.
the
There were,
operational cost
okay.
savings would exist, but is a little harder to quantify. But yeah, these are really great questions. So
Okay. 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 Good. Okay. Thanks. That's all I have for now.
sure. Sharita?
So you mentioned that the schools are in the central region, and I was just looking up the zip codes. These are all in the inner city.
I'm I'm sorry.
I said all of these schools that you had mentioned, I looked up Brown Street, Clark, Douglas. I looked up their zip codes. They're in the inner city.
Yes, they are. So again, this is where when you're looking at scenario A, and all of those schools sort of on the closure merger list are within relatively close proximity to each other. So the benefit of scenario A being that it would be a reinvestment in the other schools within that community to try to, mitigate that impact and also, um, bring something new and have that more balanced approach. So that is, I think, one of the, benefits that's the most stand out for scenario A is that it wouldn't just be sort of closing schools, it would also be reinvestments in the schools that are in that area to try to, have some positive
What
outcomes
if
as well.
scenario A doesn't fly and it goes to scenario B? Then the schools that are in that area won't get the students and they won't be benefited in scenario B. I mean,
Well, yeah,
I don't know. That's what I looked at the scenarios and that's what I saw.
yeah, no. I think you raise a good point, and that's very much what we're here to ask you all is like what feels right. The goal is not for us to ask you or the broader community necessarily like A or B, pick your choice, that's what you get. It's more so to say like, what do you like about scenario A? What do you like about scenario B? Is there a scenario C that would, bring some elements from both or add something to them? Like this is very much a time where we want to capture your feedback on these things. So I appreciate you sharing. And yeah, I'm happy to get to B. I'll take Melinda's question. And then I think once we have that full sort of run through, and I know we're down to 10 minutes here, so I do want to make sure I can get to that. But Melinda, go ahead.
Kind of like under the idea of what Sharita was saying is, and maybe because we're just looking at this piece right here, has there been any look at what is a similar scenarios that's happening on the north side, east, and the south side of Milwaukee? Where are there any comparisons that are close to this to what's happening within the 53206 and 208 zip codes with these schools?
So I would say there are no schools that are at this level of underutilization and low enrollment that are within such close proximity to each other anywhere else in the city.
And
Which
is
is
it a
why
demographic thing, or is there any look at that as to
in this next
or the
scenario, I'll show
offerings
a
of
little
what's
more
being
about.
being offered at those schools versus schools that are in those zip codes?
Yeah, and I think a lot of this ties to that, right? So knowing that schools that have these limited budgets, as you mentioned earlier, and are spending a lot just to keep that really, sort of critical staff on site. And so how do you find ways to, have fewer and fuller schools that are more sustainable to operate and offer more robust programming? So there is a little bit more data that I'd like to show in scenario B, and then happy to jump right back to this conversation. But just so we can sort of lay it out fully.
Yeah, and just a suggestion, and I could put that in the information thing of a scenario C is maybe what needs to be looked at is the funding options, the way that various schools are funded. Someone mentioned earlier about the fact of whether or not money follows students. No, it doesn't. After Third Friday, we start to get this influx of students Third Friday in September and Third Friday in January. We get this influx of students both from private schools, but then also from schools within MPS. And that school got that money, and that's where the money stays.
Yep. No, that's definitely something that we've heard, throughout. We just, changing the funding model for
Yeah, because
those
we've cut those staff
is
members by
also,
that point, you know, but we're
yeah,
getting all
yeah.
these kids.
But like I know that Michael, blanking on his last name, the guy who's on the enrollment team who was with us for the one meeting and talked about, you know, how California funds their schools a little differently and does average count. So there is precedent for other ways to do it, but it is, yeah, it's a large undertaking. And, you know, I think we're trying to lay out and do that balance of like, what can the district look at now that are, you know, really some potentially more immediate strategies that can be implemented, and how do you simultaneously sort of in a parallel lane work on some strategies to get out of the cycle and change the way that the system operates. So I'm gonna get through scenario B just to make sure we have time, and then, like I said, happy to carry on. So these are the closure schools without receiving schools. So the benefits here would be, you know, prioritizing student choice. Someone mentioned in one of the earlier meetings, scenario A was their preference, but scenario B felt more like how parents are, you know, really choosing schools. They want to, you know, go to their top priority school, and that there is realistically no way to, you know, a student cannot like in an open choice environment, like they can choice to another school. They don't have to go to their merger school. So keeping that in mind, if the district were to prioritize trying to, you know, support individual students and families at that level, the broader program access, so students would then have greater access to programs, courses, extracurriculars at higher utilization schools. It would also allow the district to take that needs-based investment approach just based on those tiered lists. You know, we do want to highlight here the sort of contrast with scenario A in the sense that this wouldn't necessarily do anything to help the schools that are also on that closure merger list. They would remain on that list, you know, unless they were able to sort of, there wouldn't be any intentionality around them sort of enrolling new students from the closure schools. So that would be a challenge that could just be perceived as something that might continue to be a challenge down the road without any intervention. So the proposed closures that we've laid out here are the 6 that are showing on the screen here. So the one key difference from this scenario from a closure perspective is that Douglas would go from a receiving school to also a closure site. And I'll get into that in a second here. In terms of consideration, so again, minimizing disruption, looking at those low enrollment, low utilization schools, trying to limit the amount of students and families who are impacted, really looking closely at the priority scores and the factors driving those. So like building conditions, those considerations, and are there available schools nearby? So if those students chose to stay in that area, would there be options that have open seats for them? And those were one of the key considerations. So I'll move through these at a decent pace. These tables on the right are the same as the ones before. So just showing that data, looking at the enrollment and building utilization of Douglas, it is in sort of the bottom lowest percentile for the district. There are schools nearby that have available space. And what I really want to make sure we have time to focus on, and this will be more illustrative for the other schools in the scenario, but these green hexagons are showing where students who are enrolled at Douglas live within the city. So the darker green that you see means a higher concentration of Douglas students living in that area. And these are where the students who attend Douglas are coming from. We don't have attendance areas, but what I'll be touching on in the upcoming slides are just those capture rates of students from the attendance areas. On the inverse of that, we wanted to show where students who live near Douglas are attending school, just to really highlight, you know, how much students within the district, depending on the area where they live, are really attending school all over the place. So that is a more common trend that you see on the northern side of the city, is that students are traveling far to get to school. So I know that's consistent with some of the data we shared before, but this is just another way to illustrate it. So you'll see that light blue shaded area around Douglas. That's a 1 mile drive shed around the school. And any students who live within that mile of Douglas, these are the schools they're attending. The larger the circle you see means that there is a higher concentration of students attending that school. So when we move to another site, you'll look at Hopkins Lloyd. Again, low enrollment and utilization, building conditions, and then the proximity to schools with space nearby. So Hopkins Lloyd, these are where Hopkins Lloyd students are living. So in these sort of green hexagons again, and you'll see that of the 230 students who actually live within their attendance area and are age eligible to attend Hopkins Lloyd, only 19 of those 230 are attending Hopkins Lloyd. So that's about an 8% attendance area capture rate. and we're going to go through this. So we have these here for each school. Really, the idea is not to, belabor the point, but more so to give you the data to take home when you look at it later. So Hopkins Lloyd, within that 1 mile drive shed, these are where those students are attending school throughout the city. And these are all MPS students, just to be clear. So students enrolled in MPS. From there, we have Clark Street. So I'll move quickly through these. I know we're short on time. Clark Street is capturing about 10% of the students from within its attendance area, so 21 out of 204. And Clark Street students are also traveling across the city for their schools. When we look at Seifert, again, similar conditions, so we tried to be consistent with those. And then I believe Seifert has the lowest capture rate of any of the schools listed here, which is just under 5%. So 19 out of 385 who live within the attendance area who are attending Seifert. These are age-eligible students. These are where students living near Seifert are attending school, so spread out across the city. Our Ave, the capture rate, is about 7%, so 33 of the students enrolled there. So that's 33 out of those 150 are attending, are living within the attendance area. And then of all the age-eligible students who are attending MPS schools within that area, only about 7% are going to our. And these are where students who live near our are attending school throughout the city. And then last, touching on Keefe. So Keefe has about an 11% area capture rate, so 35 out of 315, and students who are traveling across the city to attend school. So the changes here is just that you'll see the capacity does get a bit lower. Douglas having a significant capacity that is added from a closure perspective. And then the enrollment, obviously we can't project that not knowing where these students would go. And it would be, a complicated process to try to reflect that in this map. And so then just showing the coverage change. So that is just the key difference there being Douglas closed, whereas in the other map, Douglas was remaining open from a coverage standpoint. And just to be clear, these are only elementary and K-8 schools that are showing on these maps. So this does not show traditional middle schools or high schools, which would include K-12s. So on the building investment, focused investment front, these are the same 3 tiers that we had before. The regional distribution shown here, so just tier 0 removed, and then the 3 tiers for program. I'm going to move quickly through this just because I know we're at time. So these last slides are just summarizing what we looked through in terms of the 2 different approaches. So a merger-focused approach versus a closure-focused one. And then just some considerations and impacts. So we tried to highlight where there was sort of shared impacts and considerations. I think it's helpful to look at it this way, but just, really the through line of minimizing disruption and trying to focus on those schools with the fewest students, improving student access to our resources by having them at higher utilization schools, smaller schools being more costly to operate, and then potential cost savings and avoidance by way of doing that. So the only other thing here that we were going to note was just sort of ringing the bell again on the town hall meetings. If you didn't get a chance to jot those dates down, again, we'll send this presentation out as soon as we wrap here tonight. But just want to make sure that we make you all feel very invited, very welcome. We want to elevate your voices at those meetings, given all the work that you've put in, and make sure that you have a chance to share your perspective and insights with the broader community. With that, I'm happy to stop talking and listen if anybody has any questions or if needs to jump. There is nothing else content-wise that we're going to share, so happy to stay on for a few minutes longer if anyone had specific feedback or questions or clarifying points.
I have just one quick question.
Please.
So in scenario B, where basically it's the family's choice for which school to send their child to, I know right now one of the biggest issues that I've run into is just schools cutting off enrollment. So how would that be mitigated where a school is saying, a school closes and the parent is like, okay, well, I want to send my child to this school, even though they do have a choice. What will be the approach to make sure that receiving school or chosen school can't say, sorry, we just won't take your child?
Yeah, no, it's a great question and something we want to make sure we speak to. So our recommendation would be for there to be an exception provided to those families where they are able to choose, the school that they want to attend, knowing that those schools in question, whatever they maybe are enrolling new students every year. And that is part of their process if they have and ended up in a space where they're over enrolled, but we do think it really highlights the importance of that, policy initiative where enrollment caps start to be enforced, because otherwise that problem just could continue to grow. And so we do think there's a really important sort of tie between those two efforts and pathways.
Okay, thank you.
If you invested in the central city schools, so scenario A, is there any research or an example of that being the thing that turns, I'm just wondering because it sounds like a lot of kids are living in the area that aren't going to those schools,
Right.
right? And so they could reach capacity. In theory, it's just that people are choosing not to go to those schools. So I'm wondering if how would the investment equal drawing in not just the kids who were being merged, but like, could it beef up enrollments just because kids in the area would want to go to those schools? Like, is there precedent for that? Or once an area has kind of, once parents start to choose not to send their kids in their neighborhood without a mandate, without a policy, do they, you know, change that direction and decide that, oh, now that there's this new school and or would it even be called a new school? Because it feels like, sorry, I'm just thinking through this, but it feels like, for example, all of these schools, if they're living in that general area, they're so close together, they could have gone to any of those. And so the families that are living in that area and are not going to those areas, if you merge it and you still keep the one of the old school's names, why would they be like, oh, now there's this new opportunity. I should rethink traveling across the city to go to this other school because I can get this quality education in my backyard. So I guess my equity lens and just care for the city lens does see the benefits in scenario A, but I'm just not sure that investment then would equal members of the neighborhood wanting to send their kids to the schools, and then wouldn't it just be, I mean, the scenario of the school that's on the merger list that had already been merged sounds like that's a scenario of, of two schools being merged for the same reason, but then people not being happy and leaving. And we're back in the same spot. So that's an outcome here is we could merge these schools together, and in the database it could say that we're going to have 370 kids,
Right.
right, but they could still choose not to. And you know,
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I'll try to make sure I respond to it. So I would say there's not definitive precedent on, how that has been like. I don't think anybody could say definitively, right? Like it could be happen one way somewhere and another way elsewhere. Like I think it really sort of depends on the details. And certainly hear you on like, they're not obligated to go to their merger school. I mean, we even had a suggestion in last night's meeting where someone said, well, maybe you could proceed with scenario A, and if students chose not to go to their merger school, you could still support them with finding another school within the district so as not to have them leave MPS altogether, right? Like, what are those middle grounds? But the more important point that I want to speak to of what you said is that notion of like, how do we make sure this merger is attractive beyond just the families who are already part of those schools, right? Like, if you're making an investment in that building, I think a really important conversation to have is what's the right investment? What's going to help achieve our goals, and is the goal to sort of capture more students who live near the school? If so, how are we engaging with the community to make sure that, during that planning year, to make sure that this is the right fit? Or even if you're not able to do that sort of strong engagement, like if you're improving the building, like how are you marketing that? How are you letting people know about those changes that you're making and that there is something coming here? So maybe that plays a part in how you select what the building investment would be. Michelle, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Rebecca, I think what you're honing in on is that how you do it and the engagement and how we work with the community is really important. So, you know, I don't think we can emphasize that enough, you know. So it's anytime you make a change, right? You need to engage and make sure you're doing the right thing. So it's not just a simple, you know, wash your hands of it and it's done. No, there's work to be done. Lots of work.
Agreed. And yeah, I think the awareness part is also really big, like letting people know. And, you know, I would say generally speaking, not to paint with too broad of a brush, but public school districts are not always their own best like cheerleaders, and letting people know the great things that are going on. And I know that some of the feedback we've heard here is just like people don't always know how wonderful like of things that are being done at MPS schools and within the district. And so, you know, again, tying back to those other pieces, how can the district do a better job of letting people know? And it's, you know, creating positive change in communities, especially. Any other questions folks have?
Nate, it's Paula.
Hey.
Again, just kind of a basic question. So the schools that we've talked about tonight, those are all elementary schools, correct?
No. So some of them are, there's a K-8 and then a middle school. So Clark and Douglas being the exception.
Okay.
But otherwise
Okay.
elementary, yes.
Okay, so one middle school. And so high schools, there are no high schools that are in the conversation right now. And I thought we had some high schools that were underutilized.
There are high schools that are underutilized. High schools were reassigned from the list early on in the project. We sort of decided that wanting, you know, knowing that there are fewer of those buildings and it is generally a much larger undertaking to
Okay.
look at any sort of high school consolidation model. Now, that is not to say that, you know, going forward that those reassigned schools wouldn't be brought back onto the list and that the district couldn't pursue that. So one of the questions that came up last night too is like, is this enough, right? Like, is this enough to address the problems that MPS has? And if not, do we have to wait 10 years for the next long range facilities master plan in order to do something about it? And the short answer is no, right? Like, we intend for these tools and resources to be, again, dynamic, and the district can revisit it every year, update the data, and see like what does it want to do so that it can continue to use a consistent approach, a transparent methodology, and how it is sort of evaluating these schools and deciding what the best sort of next steps are. And Rebecca, I think your point earlier too around like building in some, you know, processes to say like these schools might be struggling, how can we try to help them out before they get to the point where we're talking about closing them, right? Like, where is that intervention at the midway point before it gets to a point where, you know, you're having this conversation? So I think there's a lot of pieces that fold into that.
Yeah, just one other thought that's been bothering me, and it's that just from a mathematical position or viewpoint, we have so many students who are enrolled in MPS now. We have so many seats available, the capacity.
Yep.
And, you know, to me, it's like, how do we get closer? Complicated, obviously. But if we end up at the end of this process still with a lot of schools that are underutilized, I would think that the process hasn't been successful. Maybe the process has been, but the outcome would be less than successful. Because even, you know, looking at a school that's only 70% full, there's a lot of room. And, you know, it's hard to project the future, but, you know, are we really projecting that 30% is going to be made up over time? I don't know. It's just random thoughts that trouble me.
Yeah, I guess one thing I
Is Michelle speaking? Michelle, we
trying. Sorry, I should turn on my light. The one thing I guess I just want to say is it is really hard to remember that this is a 10, possibly 20-year plan. So we're not talking about just year one. So there's a lot of work to come from this. I sound like a parrot. But again, we are putting out some ideas to initially react to, but we do need to take all of the information here and kind of put it along that, that timeline uh, for, how does it look, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years out, maybe even a little bit longer on some items. So I hear your point, but I think we need to keep remembering this is not a one and done. This is a kind of how we work going forward, for the next couple of decades.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I would just add to that, as we've talked about previously, the value of having a more gradual approach and knowing that, school closures are also have costs associated with them, right? Like there is an entire process that comes along with that, and doing it right pays dividends in the sense that those families feel supported, they stay within the district or have a higher likelihood of doing so. And it's, sort of doing right by those school communities. There are a number of examples of districts who have taken a more aggressive approach. I think a lot of people think about Chicago 10 years ago, closing 50 schools almost overnight, and just the really strong impact that had on those, South Side communities where the majority of those schools closed were. And just that rip the Band-Aid approach can then you lose families as a result of that, and it just kind of compounds on itself. So yeah, I know that is sort of at the base of our recommendation, is making sure that the district has the appropriate staffing and support in place to make those transitions and mergers like actually successful. Yeah. Casey, I saw that you came off earlier. I just want to make sure you had a chance if you had a question.
Yeah, I mean, I just have so many thoughts, but I guess some of my thoughts, if it is a long-term plan, and I know a lot of you don't know me, but I work in the Family and Community Engagement office at MPS, and I think one of our issues always with schools is when kids live all over the city, family engagement at those schools is very low when they live further away. So when you're trying to get them back for events at night around resources and academics, a lot of times they don't come back. And so I guess my concern is that neither one of those when neither one of these scenarios really addresses encouraging parents to send their kids to neighborhood schools. And so I'm just kind of wondering because I think I was thinking like if we could even like see maps of those schools in other regions
Mhm.
where kids are coming from the neighborhood and then um, compare that to maybe the academics and why and for parents to see why it would be important for them to start or for us to start driving kids into the neighborhood schools. I don't know. I guess I'm just
Uh, Casey, does your department have the ability to potentially have data that would show that, demonstrate it?
I don't think we have the data. I guess I was just more thinking like if we see examples of maps and then just compare them to the report cards
Yeah.
to
Okay.
see, it could just be something as easy as that.
Okay. All right. All right. Yeah.
It might not correlate. I don't know. I
No,
feel like it will, but
I think
I,
it will. I think it will.
I will just say, without um, being specific, we've looked at these sort of maps of where students are coming, like going to school based on where they live, and on the south side, just again speaking in generalities, but it's a lot lower, like a lot less travel, a lot more students who are staying close to home.
right.
To your point,
All right.
Rebecca, did you have a question or a thought?
No, thank you for this. I think the two scenario approach is an interesting way to really think about some of the big questions that are underneath this. So I appreciate that. I guess my question is, I know that we had the city hall or the meetings with the community. How do you is the report just is this the end goal of the report to say, here are two scenarios, MPSU decide, or do you foresee a decision being made on which angle we go with, like how far
I
are we in the decision-making process here? Are we at the end or?
I would say we're nearing the end. To put something like to say to give it some definition, I would also point out that our goal is to make final recommendations. So what we want to hear from you all is what do you like? And it's again, it's not a fork in the road. It's not to say you either get A or you get B. That is not what we're saying. It is more so really asking like, what do you like about this one? What don't you like? What don't you understand? And then same for the other one. Is there something that could be like a scenario C or an alternative that could be a good option? And then once we have that sort of polished to a greater extent with you all, taking that draft to the broader community to say, here's kind of, what's on the table. We want to hear from you all, what you think is going to have the best impact and taking that additional feedback in. So, our goal is not to overwhelm the broader community with saying like, you have scenarios A through F here and really just laying out like, sort of the paradox of choice, but really trying to draw some distinctions between some different pathways and hear what families are going to react well to and what they think is going to better support the district. So making sure that people have a chance to share their voice.
One thing that might be helpful is in scenario B. Right now you have needs-based investments,
Yep.
meaning that like, the data that you've put together for building, and all that kind of stuff, more money would be spread out across MPS. But it might be interesting slash helpful, like you've mentioned, having multiple filters, like reinvesting in high schools or investing in schools close to the suburbs, or I don't know,
Sure.
what all those filters are. But like just because one thing that's really nice about scenario A is the structure and the planning that could go in.
Right.
Um, but I don't know that that needs to be abandoned in scenario B. It's just that the structure and the planning might not be in that central area. But it could still be, MPS, like there could still be a set of objectives or more formalized instead of kind of just scattershot, like, oh, all these schools need it, and so we're going to do things at these schools, but something that's a little bit more, I don't know, targeted.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. And high schools is definitely one we've heard about. So, yeah, and that could translate over to scenario A as well, right? Like that could be that tier one still without necessarily being tier zero. So it's a really, really good point. Any final thoughts? I do just want to let people know again, like not to, but like you are welcome to leave as you need to. Happy to stay on for a few minutes longer to hear anybody else's final thoughts or questions.
Yeah, I just want to add that to Michelle's point about this being a long-range plan, that these scenario A's and B's that are focused on the closure merger items, this is not just a closure merger plan. This is not just looking at schools that are closing and merging. This is to rebalance the district. We have tons of schools that are over-enrolled on the south side and other areas, depending on what the programs are. And those are some of the programmatic changes that need to be thought through carefully and looking at how that is distributed. And also there's the long view of planning for how to not throw money into buildings where the investment will not pay back. And that long view is developing a plan that will speak to the community in a way that will help collectively understand that we really have two choices. We can continue to cobble together a building that is past its life and pay that amount, or we can pay the amount that will revive, and replace buildings, whether it's one at a time or two at a time or whatever over a period of time. But people need to start hopefully thinking hopeful about
There,
improvement.
sorry, Linda, to jump in. refresh my memory, there is actually one additional slide that I wish we had gotten to. And I'll make sure to highlight this when I send it out to folks. But we did, to Linda's point, like this is not just about closure mergers. So one of the slides we folded in was just about some of the cost estimates that we base, sort of roughly on the recent Madison school district referendum that was passed. So they had money in there for a new elementary, a new middle, and a new high school. And so looking at those costs, basically we calculated the cost per square foot based on what they had laid out and then dollars they had asked for, and then applied that to MPS school types. So when you look at the average square footage of MPS elementary schools and K-8s, and then apply those, you're looking at about $44 to $51 million, depending on the school type for a new school. And then also, if you're looking at it from just best practices around square footage per student, which at the elementary level, there is not a nationwide standard, but regionally speaking, around 150 to 180 square feet per kid at an elementary school is what's recommended. So on the low end of that, you're seeing, again, close to 40 million. So hovering around that area if you were building a school that could fit 400 kids. So we just wanted to include this as, insight and something to consider as we're looking forward, and something that we intend to include, sort of in the plan is what does, turning the corner look like from a financial perspective. And when you start to reinvest in these buildings and even looking at new construction, making sure that the district is prepared to sort of, engage in those pursuits. So I know we're well over time. The rest of this is just a program focused investment. Engagement planning is just to give them those town hall dates, and then just a look ahead of those items that we sort of discussed already. But we'll be sharing the strategy web tool and the evaluation form on this with you all soon. And yeah, thank you all so much for taking the time again and staying on with us. And we'll send this out here shortly.
Thank you. Y'all have a good night.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.